All right, we are getting kicked off. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I am Nick Halverson, CEO, co-founder of OccuSpace. We'll give folks another 30 seconds or so to filter into the webinar room, and then we'll get kicked off with a great webinar here. I will get us started here just introducing the panel that we have to talk about navigating the tightrope of privacy. I think it's really become mainstream over the last 5 years or so to start using utilization data, particularly in office space, whether that's corporate, higher ed, government office space. That's become mainstream, but a lot of times people think it is a little bit at odds with privacy, and there's privacy pushback. And we're here today to talk about that, talk about using utilization data in office spaces and making sure you navigate the tightrope of privacy and data-driven decisions the right way, because we believe there is a right way and a wrong way to do just that. I'm going to start by introducing the panel. I'll start here with Jeff Gagnon. He is the workplace technology lead at Allegro Analytics, formerly at Raise Commercial Real Estate, Meta. Really, Jeff has a ton of experience in the corporate real estate world, working with corporate office occupiers, and that's probably still selling you short. Brian Lewis is a faculty member and assistant dean at University of Virginia. Brian has a lot of focus in cybersecurity and privacy, so he'll be a huge addition to the webinar panel today. And lastly, Nick Rao is OccuSpace's CTO and has dedicated his career to measurement businesses and bringing new data sets and measurements to different types of verticals and applications, and will be very valuable in looking at all the technology in the market. So with that, I want to briefly just define utilization data and talk a little bit about why is privacy a sensitive topic when talking about utilization data. So very simply, utilization data is data, measurement data on how people use physical spaces. That can be broken up in a couple different types of data sets. Something that we call daily visitors, could be called traffic data. Think turnstiles, how many people visit this space in a day. A lot of companies collect this in different ways, but ultimately traffic counts is one type of utilization data. Occupancy data is another type. How many people are in a space every minute of the day, usually aggregated by hours, days, weeks, months, looking at average and peak occupancy of a space. And then dwell time is probably the third most popular analytic for utilization data. How long are people spending in spaces? There's other data sets as well, but I think that broadly covers what utilization data is. And I want to hop over to a little bit about why is it privacy sensitive, and a little bit more of the foundation. I'm going to start with Jeff. Back on utilization data. Let's get us kicked off with what are the types of utilization data you've seen, particularly in the corporate office world, and what are the most common decisions people are making with this data today?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Nick. I appreciate it. Typically, we see badge data. We're increasingly seeing Wi-Fi data. There are systems in conference rooms and meeting rooms that people can pull or extract some type of utilization data from. We're even seeing kind of interesting data sources like bevy machines to give people some feel for how spaces are being used or the number of people in a space. It's really become kind of this triangulation using sensors, using badge data, using all of these sources to get to a directional answer around utilization at the right cost for corporates. And they're using it primarily to drive real estate decisions, portfolio decisions, and that obviously is a financial play for corporate users, trying to ensure that capital is effectively deployed and that they're not overspending, underspending. But we're also seeing companies index on employee experience. And so they'll apply this data along with other data to understand use cases for the office and how those are evolving over time.
Awesome. Yeah, that's fascinating that the bevy water machines, how much water are people drinking on every floor is a proxy of
Yeah,
how many people. That makes a ton of sense.
right.
And that is certainly privacy safe. Great on the use cases. That's definitely what we're seeing, right sizing portfolios and really trying to figure out how can we optimize the experience for the employees in the space. Brian, I want to move over to you and really talk about, why does privacy matter when you're talking about utilization data? Where does it get sensitive with people? What's the privacy line, so to speak?
Yeah, Nick, thanks for having me. So I teach a lot of courses in the cybersecurity and privacy space. So I get to talk to a lot of students about their perceptions of privacy. And it's really interesting, how our young people are responding to the idea of what privacy means. So typically now they expect to be tracked across things like web browsers. They're used to being advertised to based on their location and their web browsing history and that sort of thing. But when it comes to physical tracking, in a recent survey I did in the classroom, basically 45 out of 45 students said that's not okay. We don't want to be physically tracked. That's a step too far. What's really interesting about that is that they're willing to sacrifice privacy for safety. A lot of our students, unfortunately, have been in lockdown situations in their school careers, and so the idea of emergency folks knowing where people are in buildings is they were fully supportive of ideas like that. But individual tracking of, say, a student moving across campus, 45 out of 45 students in my last class just said that's not okay from a privacy perspective.
That's really interesting, and I'd like to double click on that a little bit to where they feel like location tracking crosses the line for privacy, but in certain instances, I guess depending on the use case, they're okay with it. So, I mean, are there ways where you can have that type of data, but somehow have it locked down? And do students and visitors of a space, I suppose, have that perceived privacy of they have this personally identifiable information, but I trust that they won't use it unless it's for a good cause? Or is there still a little bit of murky kind of, grayness there?
I think there's two levels of murkiness, Nick. The first is I don't think there's a full understanding of what is possible with data from both from a cell phone geolocation and from a Wi-Fi standpoint. I think there is a knowledge gap in understanding what is possible and what the people operating those systems, what data they have available to them. And then I think there's and rightfully so, there should be concerns about the idea that data can be used for good, but data can also be used for, I won't say evil, but for other purposes. One of the examples that I use in the classroom is, honor code enforcement. Is it okay for your university to ensure that you were in the library when you said you were? Another thing is parents. If you're not returning your parents' phone calls, should they be able to call the university and have them tell you, your movements over the last week? And the answer is pretty much no. And a little bit of shock and awe that that sort of data would be available to the powers that be. And so I think there's two levels here. One, there's a concern about there's a misunderstanding about knowledge of what data exists in the universe, and then I think there's a concern that data shouldn't be used unless I'm being explicitly told what it's used for.
Yeah, it seems like a trust issue, right? At the end of the day, it's a trust issue. Do students, employees trust that you're going to use the data in the ways that you've said you will?
Jeff, how do you see corporations managing this process with their employees in their office spaces, where the primary use cases are, one, right-sizing their portfolio, getting more efficient with their real estate, and two, improving the employee experience? I'm sure most employees like bad idea, but they may not like the idea of potentially maybe losing their assigned seat or their office experience changing. How have you seen the privacy response to these types of solutions in the corporate world?
I think it largely depends on the pressure the company's under. If there is no pressure and the company's ahead of the curve and trying to figure out the right application of this technology and this data, then there's more time and space for setting context, communication, setting expectations. If the company's under pressure, it needs to, very quickly make a pivot, reduce spend. It's reducing headcount, maybe. Sometimes the communication and context setting gets really wobbly, and that leads to problems because people don't understand what's happening. And as I just mentioned, that can break trust. And once trust is
Mm.
broken, it's not easy to recover from that. It really like if you were near this kind of trust equilibrium with people and you break that trust to get back to it, you've just it's an order of magnitude to get back to it.
What's the number one thing organizations do to break that trust?
Poor communication and not being completely transparent about what they're going to be using the data for.
And I'm gonna riff on this a little bit because Jeff, I love the idea of the equilibrium of trust. And I think, especially for my research and my students, it seems like it's about the proximity. So I trust that Google far off in the world isn't going to cause me any problems. But the closer that I get, whether that be my university or my employer, I think it's a little bit harder to get that trust.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. When it's your employer, your university, they impact your life a lot more directly than, say, Google can in general. Really fascinating. I want to shift a little bit to talking about the technology landscape of utilization data and bring in Nick Rao, our CTO, who really understands the technology better than most, to talk a little bit about the different types of way to capture utilization data, specifically from a privacy perspective, just to kind of set the foundation for what are the different methods people are using today.
Yep. Great to be here as well. So there are a wide variety of techniques for gathering space utilization data, different technologies that are out there. And I like to always think of this potential tension between very high quality measurement and privacy. Something that I like to say a lot is that if you have 100% in accuracy, where everyone is moving at every moment in time, you have zero privacy, really, in that case. And so the technology plays a huge role in that, and going in hand with the technology, I think fidelity of your measurement also plays a really big role with that. And so just to look at some of the technologies that are leveraged today, you have everything from starting with simple turnstiles and passive infrared beams. These are very simple technologies. Really no privacy concerns around them per se. They cannot identify anything about a person. Very low fidelity with these technologies too, is a key point. Then you can move into other technologies that are out there that the fidelity increases, but you potentially get to more problematic areas. So you can employ things like cameras, for instance, to look at space utilization. And that's an area where you have to be very careful because even a single image these days of an individual can readily lead to identification of that person just based on one shot. So cameras can be on the other end of the spectrum and very problematic. Companies leverage technologies such as heat thermal approaches. Those tend to be pretty good in terms of privacy, much harder to link that type of data set to an individual person. And then there are data sets out there such as Wi-Fi and Bluetooth data. And I think what's key about those data sets is how are you gathering those data sets? If you're reliant on third-party data sets to bring in and come in, that's where you can get into real problems around privacy issues, and as well as data quality, which can be a big factor there too. So again, I always think of this tension between measurement accuracy and privacy. And I think a key point that I would want to make is that there are a variety of technologies out there, and it's about picking the right mix with the right fidelity so that you can get actionable data, but still protect people's privacy at the same time. And it's something that you absolutely can do. It takes a concerted focus on those selections.
Yeah, thanks for explaining that. I think it's well said, and those different buckets to think about is, what's the source data that the company is using and how privacy safe is that source. Cameras a little bit less, millimeter wave like radar or thermal, very privacy safe. Then what does the company actually do with that data? And even many of the camera solutions on the market are really putting privacy first in how they handle those images and deleting them on device. And then there's, a little bit of first party and third party aspects, and even data granularity. You could have very privacy safe thermal or millimeter wave data capture sources that really have no idea of who you are. But if you're reporting it at a desk level, then that might start to pull back on some of that privacy. And so I want to throw it over to you, Jeff. I know you've talked about this at length of data granularity, desk level, neighborhood pod level, building floor. Just what are you seeing the trends are in the market of how companies are thinking about it and how it pertains to privacy?
Well, putting aside privacy for just a moment, the cost of implementing solutions around utilization data could be very high. And that's not just sensors. Anytime you engage the organization in Wi-Fi or whatever the capture methods are, there's a cost associated with it. The cost could be time, but there's a cost associated with it. And so for my perspective, it really makes sense to strike a balance between cost and the level of data that's required or accuracy in that data to drive a decision. Do you really need 100% if you're going to pay an 80% premium? Probably not, right? You're looking for signal and strong enough signal that you can, reasonably make a decision with, but while mitigating some risk associated with it. And so moving privacy back into the conversation again, when I started doing utilization studies, we were monitoring at a desk level with heat and thermal. Nobody does that any longer. Very few companies do desk level monitoring just for the reasons we're talking about today. It's personally identifiable information. How a person uses their seat and how much time they spend at their desk is readily available. So I'm seeing companies move more towards kind of this pod approach. And it's what we did at Meta when we were deploying technologies and studies to understand utilization. In order to protect individual privacy, we would group desks in pods, 10, 20 desks at a time, and we would report on an aggregate utilization for that pod. But that was enough data and accuracy to inform the decisions that we were trying to make. So I think we've kind of gone from this place where everybody wanted desk level utilization, and then we quickly kind of saw the downside of doing that, because that data lives on forever. So you never know how it's going to be used to drive or inform decisions or behavior. So now we're kind of at this pod level. So it's still high enough fidelity to inform decisions, but not personally invasive.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up. I felt like I was banging my head against a wall in 2020 or 2021 even, of people would have 5 million square feet of space and they'd want desk level data. And I was like, there's no way you're going to be looking at that level to make the real high ROI decision. So I'm happy that you're seeing that in the market, that people are transitioning a little bit away from that desk level data. I want to double click a little bit on something you'd hit on, Nick, and that's the difference between first party data and third party data for different types of ways to measure utilization in the space, and just how people should be thinking about the difference there.
Yep. So just to define these things very clearly, so first-party data is data that the space utilization provider is actually generating themselves through their own sensors or whatever approach they're utilizing. Third-party data is data sets that somebody else generated, and then that space utilization provider uses those data sets to provide some distilled insights into space behavior. So the key point is that the third-party data, you do not really know how that data was gathered and collected. It could be provided to you with the representation that it is privacy safe, but if there is an unintentional mistake or perhaps an intentional change, there could be, and there often is, privacy sensitive information in those data sets. You don't know if you didn't collect it, is the main point. And so that is a key aspect of that. There also are huge implications in just quality of data. That's not a topic that we're really focused on today, but those effects play a big role in that space as well. So, so third-party data, if you're using third-party data for your space insights, you have to be very, very careful on where those sources of data are coming from. It's something that you need to vet very carefully. And it's an ongoing thing because it's not just a one-time check that you're using it in the right way. Platforms can change, bugs can happen, mistakes can be made. And before you know it, you can be getting very sensitive data sets that are coming over that you may not want to have in your possession at all.
Yeah, I want to build on that and open it up to the panel. I really, believe the vast majority of companies in this space are really putting privacy first in how they operate and how they build their technology. But there are some companies that have more elective anonymous data. And there's a difference between being absolutely anonymous and being electively anonymous. I want to double click on that. Brian and Jeff, feel free to chime in here a little bit on how do you think people would really respond to solutions that have that elective anonymity where, the corporation or the higher ed institution essentially has the ability to pick and choose if they want this to be personally identifiable information or not? Have you come across folks who have rolled out solutions like that and what the response is? I'm just curious to what you think there.
Just for the benefit of the audience and everybody watching, Nick, maybe we can talk more specifically about the third party versus the first party, and like what's a practical example of third party to make sure everybody's on the same page. We've been kind of talking about it conceptually. I'm going to make sure we land it for everybody.
Yeah, generally there's a number of companies that will use third-party access point data. They'll integrate with your access points that supply Wi-Fi to the space. When people log into Wi-Fi, there is personally identifiable information. Some solutions can obfuscate that. Some solutions make it optional to obfuscate that. So that's really the main section that we're talking about here.
So from my perspective, I don't know why we're not giving people the option to join or be tracked. Like to me, it's a trade-off. Like if you say to me, if I'm an employee at a corporate, and you say to me, if you're willing to share this data, this is what we can do with it. This is how we can improve the experience for you. This is how we can make sure that, when you go to the cafe, it's not a stack line that's going to take you 30 minutes just to get your food. Or we're going to help you find your colleagues in the space more quickly and more efficiently, or available resources. Sure, that makes a lot of sense. I opt into it. But I don't see a lot of corporates at this point, Nick, like giving their people optionality in that decision. It's binary. It's on or off.
And just double check, you guys can hear me now. I switched up the mics. Sorry about that. I think one of the lessons that We have venture student groups, propose business ideas in both cyber classes and privacy classes. And it's the idea that you can't lose and you can't misuse what you don't have. So in data collection, even if there's a chance, we're not going to use this data, we're going to leave it here, we're always going to set it aside. That is a target for the bad actors, and that is a target for unintended use of data. And so it's always better from a privacy perspective just not collect it if that's at all possible technically.
Yeah, that makes sense. When all three of you have been at different types of large organizations prior to OccuSpace. Nick was at Nielsen and several other companies as well. When you're with a large organization and you're vetting different types of technologies to purchase for really anything, but let's confine it to utilization data, what do you think the key questions organizations should be asking to make sure that they're getting a privacy safe solution?
Well, I think coming from the technology standpoint, first, and from my perspective, I think you need to clearly understand the sources of your data. You need to have a very good idea of how the full chain of the technology solution works, from collection to representation of that data to you. It's critical to just understand the landscape that the vendor or vendors you're looking to use, how they employ those technologies, and what is actually being collected and represented. That's purely from a technology standpoint, and then I think communication is a big part of it too. When you roll out these solutions, there's an education aspect that needs to happen with folks that are around. This is not something that should be hidden. It's something that organizations should be transparent on what they're doing. Why? Generally, the goals are all aligned. It's to provide more efficient use of assets. It's to provide a better end user experience. And so we've generally found that when there's good communication around these things, that you get more successful outcomes. And so those are some of the main things that come to mind for me.
Yeah, my experience, Nick, has been that corporates and the privacy kind of vetting and communication that happens is not fully developed yet. It's emerging subject matter expertise, but sometimes it's led from different parts of the organization. Sometimes it's led from IT, sometimes it's led from legal. Depending on where the skill set and the capability exists, the questions are different, the concerns are different. The thoughts and motivations around how the data is used are a little bit different. I don't feel like, from a privacy perspective, the vetting process for technologies is very well defined as an industry. Like, I don't think we're at a point yet where we do that really well. I think there's still some more education and process that needs to be built around this subject to really do it well. It seems, in other words, very kind of a very kind of different experience company to company. And it shouldn't. I think these concerns are pretty consistent, whether you're talking about corporate or higher ed. The concerns are pretty consistent, and we should be able to build thoughtful, efficient process and vetting around it. We're just not there for some reason right now.
And Jeff, I'll echo that. I think it would be great to have a privacy safe certification for a platform, like some of the efforts that were made on the IoT front, but it just doesn't exist. And I think the problem's getting worse with the advent of, there used to be some level of comfort in obscurity, that my record is one of 20 million records, but especially now with the ability to turn AI against big data sets, you can find things and patterns that would take a very large team of data scientists to find. And so I think the collection of data at the source is one of the first questions that any company should be asking.
That's a really good point. That kind of safety in numbers feeling it goes away when it's so easy to analyze big data sets these days with different AI tools. That's a really interesting point. I hadn't totally thought about. I want to answer Lindsay's question in the comments, as it is a great segue into what I want to talk about next, which is really communication and change management, which is half the battle of a successful implementation of utilization data in office spaces. It's one thing to pick a privacy safe solution. The next half of the battle is making sure your employees understand the privacy aspects you've taken with this solution, what you're going to do with this data, and give them lots of different ways to provide feedback. So Lindsay's question is, what does successful communication look like to you for building trust? When testing surveys, for example, our students wouldn't read into paragraphs that explain how we'll use their data. It was too much information. We received similar comments from staff, too many emails and Slack messages, meetings. Essentially, is there a simple and clear way to build trust in communicating about a solution like this? I'll open it up to any of you that want to hit on that first.
Yeah, it's a really good point. The channels of communication that we use, you just experience overload as the receiver of that information, depending on who you are and what your focus is. So breaking through that barrier can be rather challenging, but it doesn't mean that you don't try. It doesn't mean that you don't communicate. It doesn't mean that you don't build context and share that context. It's really important to do that. For corporate users, they have to get really creative about how they share the message. They can share the message in the various communication channels. They can do videos, they can do forums, all kinds of things. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to build that message in context so that people understand what's happening. And it's also important to realize that with communication, not everybody comes along in that thread equally. There will be some people that don't get the message, some people that don't understand the message, some people that don't like the message. You'll hear those voices reflected in feedback, but it's important to weight that across the group and not just based on volume.
Yeah, Jeff, that's great points. Lindsay, it's not just your students. We're in looking at privacy research, the latest Pew research, nobody reads these disclaimers, these privacy policies. Nobody understands what they're agreeing to. All of you use Google. Have you read the 38-page privacy policy? I doubt that you have. But what seems to work for us is scenarios. Just one, explain why from a benefit perspective. We want this data so we can advise you of the lines at the cafe or how many seats are available in the computer lab. And then scenarios where instead of abstract 2-paragraph disclaimers, with this data, we would be able to do X. Would you opt into that level of data discovery? It seems very effective and crystallizes things for people if you can actually put it into scenarios that with this data, we can do this.
Yeah, and I think Jeff and Brian had great points there. And just to build on that a bit is that I just very much view it as that this data is not just for a small set of people, puppet masters making grand decisions at the top. This data has value for everyone, all the way down to the end users of the space, whether they're students at a university or faculty, or if they're employees in a corporate location. I made the point earlier that we want to improve these spaces, make them more effective and functional for people to do what they're there for. And so those data sets have value for faculty to see. I'm sure they're interested in how their classrooms and their labs and spaces are utilized, and students as well. Knowing how busy the library is before you go there. These are all, the point is that the data set, I firmly believe, has value to everyone. And the more that you expose views into it to everyone, so you understand how it's being collected and what the utility of it is, that's a big part of building trust as well.
Yeah.
I think,
100. Go ahead, Jeff.
oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I think there's an opportunity for corporates to elevate this conversation to, um, the culture level for a company. So, it's not often that companies talk about their culture and include things like privacy. The culture can be about the mission and vision, long-term goals and objectives for the company. But I think if you elevate this conversation around privacy, whether it's privacy for internal users or privacy for product, it's an important piece of the conversation that's missing, I think, from a cultural perspective. And if you think about that conversation at a culture level, then you're starting to force that conversation in places it maybe hasn't traditionally been in the past, and keeps it front and center in a way that it doesn't really work that way now. Right now, real estate wants to do a study and learn something about utilization. And so it forces this conversation about PII, data capture, location tracking, which is the way some people unfortunately think about it. And that's maybe a little too late to the party. I think if you elevate this to the culture level, it might shed a different light and put it in the right context.
Yeah, I agree. I think the situations where we see it backfire the most is when people want to deploy a solution over the weekend with no communication, and people walk
Yeah.
in and they're like, hey, what's going on? Or if it's a solution they can't see, somebody makes a decision and then they're like, wait a minute, how do you have this data? You haven't even communicated to me. I I don't have the ability to add a comment here, but I'm sure somebody on my team is in the room and can add a comment. There's a little bit of a shout out I want to give to UC San Diego. They have a website where they host all the information about this program in measuring utilization across their office spaces, FAQs, town hall video links. I really think they've done a phenomenal job of being able to have a single place. And to kind of answer Lindsay's question, there can be a lot of different ways to communicate, but if there's one website where you have all the information about this project, FAQs, you're upfront and clear about privacy practices you're taking, that's probably the best practice I've seen, rather than just sending out an email and hoping everybody read it. Just have a website that lives, where people can check it at any point and is updated over time. Thank you, Matt, for posting that. That's very helpful. And I would also agree that the best practices we've seen is aligning incentives with the people in the space that everybody here talked about. We've seen a number of different ways to incentivize the space occupiers, the employees in the area, of how am I going to get benefit from this data set, to what's in it for me. Everybody wants to know what's in it for them. And we've seen organizations who have been able to say, hey, if you continue to optimize your space and maybe go from assigned seating to unassigned seating, you can get new furniture, or maybe your department can receive part of the savings in real estate costs from optimizing your space. Some people even do direct bonuses to employees who give up their assigned seat, which leads to savings in real estate costs. And so there's a lot of different incentive programs that people do, but I also think ultimately, if you can tie it back into this, data is going to help create a better workplace, work environment for you, whether it's through better furniture, better amenities in the space, being able to see how busy a space is before I come in. That's a really important aspect of this, is aligning those incentives to make people feel like they're going to get something out of it. They're just not going to get these sensors, this data in their space, and all of a sudden, it's just a negative for them. There's got to be an upside for everybody in the space.
And now, Nick, if I can, as I was in a 4.5-hour lockdown at my university yesterday, I will say the student perceptions on the benefit of knowing where people are in an emergency situation is a huge marketing boon. It seems to be something that the students universally understand and fully endorse.
And I would also say it's interesting to hear this conversation and hear Brian talk about it. The terminology that we use is, I think, sets us up for success or not in this conversation too. When you think about building trust, you know, the word student infers a standard of care, right? Along with it, you're there to shepherd and take care of, nurture, grow. On the corporate side, we use employee a lot, and I get it. It's uh, a legal designation. It stems from contract law. I totally understand. But when you're talking about privacy and you're calling somebody an employee, those two things are juxtaposed to one another, and it might set the wrong intention. You're a team member, you're a valued member of the team, you're part of an organization, you're what you the special sauce that makes it grow and succeed. We need to find different terminology if we're going to continue to build trust.
Yeah, definitely. That building trust is so key to this. I want to answer a couple more questions in the comments. Jerry asked, on a privacy scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most private, how would you rate solutions that collect data that hits on access point devices? I'll give a quick answer, and I'd love for Nick Rao and anybody else to comment on this. I think there's different ways where you could leverage access point data that can be privacy safe and not privacy safe. It really depends, and that's where you really have to figure out what is the source third-party data that this company is getting from an access point company. There's some ways to do it where you only get anonymous data from your Aruba or Cisco access points, and that can be privacy safe, and the third-party company that's then analyzing that data doesn't have any PII. I've seen in most instances those companies are getting access to privacy sensitive information, and I've seen companies that let you opt into seeing that PII or not, which is obviously a red flag of if you want to be privacy safe and they're giving you the option, they have that data. So in some cases, Jerry, I would say they can be very privacy safe. In most cases that I've seen, they are on the low end of that scale. They're probably, in my opinion, the least privacy safe solutions on the market. But it really does depend on what does that data feed look like coming from the access points to the third party. That's where all of the information that could be personally identifiable will live.
Yeah, I think you said it very well, Nick. And what I would just say is that it's on the lower end of the 1 to 10 scale, Jerry. It's never going to be 10 when you're using third-party data because you didn't collect it yourself. And so how do you know in the end that you're not getting data sets that you do not want to have in your data stores that could be very sensitive? And again, these things can happen intentionally. They can also happen completely unintentionally. Bugs exist and happen in software systems all the time, and you can end up getting things from a supplier that they're not even aware that they're sending to you. So I just think, third party, Nick said it well, you really have to, I think, ask a lot of questions and be very invested in evaluating the particular solution that you're looking at.
Yeah. And another question from Linus. What are some effective ways you've seen to incentivize end users to embrace this change? We talked about this a little bit. I gave a couple examples of new furniture, of department budgets getting some of the space savings, of even employees getting some bonuses from this. Those are the ways I've heard from our clients to embrace this change. And to be very specific, the change that really unlocks space savings with utilization data, the number one change is a shift from assigned seating to unassigned seating. That's when you really start to get the flexibility and power to optimize space. But I'd love to hear from Jeff and Brian of, maybe you have heard of these incentives different ways, or you've got ideas, or maybe you haven't. But are there any other ways where you've seen companies align the incentives well with the end users?
Those are the ones that I see the most. But I think there's also, again, there's this kind of economic trade-off because, this conversation is not just about savings from a real estate perspective. It's also about churn, right? So if you make a decision that turns people off enough to the point that like they don't really want an unassigned space. They want to have an assigned desk, and it's so problematic for them that they end up leaving. That's a cost that far outweighs the cost of real estate. So there's this kind of middle ground where you can provide flexibility, you can give people choice, still save money and optimize the portfolio, but not push it so far that the cost savings from real estate impact people and performance.
And Nick, your customers are my colleagues, so I think you hit on a lot of it. But it's really about perceived benefit, what you can do, and whether that's finding a study space quicker, or an open library desk, or even things like geolocation, so that if you're near the central quad, that they're giving away free pizza. That sort of targeted geolocation advertising is interesting to students because they're used to it. And they fully expect it, but they have to see a benefit from the invasion of their privacy, if we want to call it an invasion. But that perceived benefit is really important to message to the entire community.
Yeah, definitely. And Jeff, I really liked that framing of making sure, I guess the juice is really worth the squeeze. There's maybe outside, probably slightly outdated 330-300 rule in real estate, where you spend $3 per square foot on utilities, $30 per square foot on rent, and $300 per square foot on people cost. And I think those numbers have all probably inflated a little bit at this point, but the general proportions are true. And you could cut your real estate costs 10%, but if you hurt your employee productivity by 1%, that wipes out the gains in real estate savings. And so really making sure you make sure you're not sacrificing employee experience, productivity for real estate savings could end up biting you in the long term if it has that negative employee experience.
But I totally agree with what Brian said. I mean, reducing, and I guess friction is a word that's become overly used, but I think it still holds true. If I have to go into work and there's a lot of friction associated with it, I've already had a commute, but I can't easily find a desk, I can't find the amenities that I want, whatever it is, like that just reduces the likelihood dramatically that I'm going to come back because the experience was so painful. I can be at home, I can be productive, I'm giving up some collaboration as a result of that, but I'm willing to, and this is a personal statement, but I think maybe it's reflected in a way others think as well. I'm willing to give up some personal information so that I can have a better experience when I come to the office, that it can be efficient. I can find the people, I can find the resources I need instantly, effortlessly.
Yeah, definitely. Robin has a question. What other models have you seen that leverage governance effectively to anticipate and address the range of concerns raised in using such technologies? Anybody want to jump in on that one?
I'm not sure where to start with this one. Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in with a fairly annoying academic response, which it goes back to the 70s and codifying fair information practice, where you're disclosing what you're going to do, what you're going to collect, what you're going to do, and you give people the right to opt out of it, correct it, or delete it if they don't want to participate. Ultimately, that type of framework is common law in theory in throughout the EU and North America, but it's using that sort of philosophy that we're not going to do things with your data unless we tell you what we're going to do with your data. And if you can adopt that sort of policy and framework, you're going to be in line with what people's expectations are, in my experience.
Yeah, I don't know that I have a lot to add here. I haven't seen great governance models on the corporate side. It's a gap.
Yeah, it makes me think of, it's not directly answering this, but the most effective line of communication from leadership at organizations I've seen roll this out is to be very upfront early on in communication and town halls that this data isn't going to answer all the questions of what you're going to do with your space, or it's not going to answer all the questions of what to do with your space. It'll help you ask the right questions to the right stakeholders so you can have honest conversations about how to effectively optimize your space. Maybe a department has 80 desks and they only use 10 or 20 of them at any given point. There could be a good reason for that. There might not be a good reason for that, but for those department heads and stakeholders in the organization to know that if the data says something, you're not just going to make a decision right there. You're going to approach them and have a conversation about it and better understand the context of how you use your space. Maybe it's a lab and all your people are out diving in the ocean doing research all day long, but they still need these spaces when they get back. So there's different approaches, but I'd say being honest that if you don't use your space, there very well may be times where we want to optimize it, and you could lose some of that square footage and desks, but we're not going to do it without having a conversation with you and understanding the full context of how you, your department, your organization use this space. And I think that's been well received from folks. I think we got through all of the questions and really hit all the important topics that I wanted to hit today. We've got about 8 minutes left, so if there's any other questions, we can get to them. But I think we've hit the core tenets of what is utilization data, why does privacy matter, and why can it be sensitive to employees in the space, the different types of technology stacks, how to think about privacy from the data aspect and the source of the data, and then change management being the other big thing. And how do you properly communicate to employees and office occupiers when rolling these types of solutions out to space? So I really appreciate everybody on the panel here. Thank you, everybody that came in to watch this and ask questions and comments. Feel free to follow up with myself or anybody else here with any other specific questions. But unless Nick, Jeff, Brian, you have anything else you want to add before we wrap, let me know.
This was really fun. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me. Brian, I love the idea about privacy certification. I think we should all get together and talk about that. That's
next.
That's amazing.
That's next.
Yeah, that is seriously a great idea. That would be very helpful. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye.